bread was hard, and the crust cut into Eliza Bramwell's palm as she broke it into smaller pieces so it would last through supper. Across the table, her stepsisters laughed over a cake still warm from the oven, its sugar glaze catching the candlelight, and neither of them offered her a single crumb. Eliza did not ask. She had learned long ago that asking only made the silence colder. The dining room at Bramwell Hall was grand, with high windows and a carved ceiling that had impressed visitors for 3 generations, but grandeur meant nothing to a girl who ate crusts at the foot of the table, while her stepmother, Lady Constance Bramwell, presided from the head like a queen guarding her court. Charlotte and Diana, the 2 daughters Constance had brought into the marriage, wore new gowns ordered from a dressmaker in town. Eliza's gown had been let out twice and mended at the hem, and still she wore it without complaint, because complaint had a cost in this house, and she could not afford it. She was 19 years old, the only child of the late Edmund Bramwell, a man who had died 5 years earlier, and left his estate, his fortune, and his daughter in the care of a woman who had never once looked at Eliza with warmth. Constance had married Edmund for the house and the name, and when he died, she kept both, along with a stepdaughter she treated as a servant who happened to share the family table, when she was allowed to share it at all. "You are slow tonight, Eliza," Constance said without looking up from her plate. "The others have nearly finished." "Yes, madam," Eliza said, and broke off another piece of the hard bread. Charlotte, the elder stepsister, smiled the way she always did, when she wanted to be cruel, without seeming cruel, a small curve of the lips that never touched her eyes. Perhaps if she ate faster, she would grow up sooner. She still looks like a child playing at being a lady. Diana laughed, covering her mouth with a lace handkerchief, and Eliza kept her eyes on her plate, because looking up would only give them more to laugh at. She had trained herself over the years to become a kind of quiet furniture in her own home, present but unnoticed, useful but unloved. It was not the life her father had promised her when he was alive, and she was small enough to sit on his knee while he read to her from his favorite books. But her father was gone, and promises made by the dead could not be collected. What none of them knew, not Constance, not Charlotte, not Diana, was that a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Cawdry had stopped on the road outside Bramwell Hall that very afternoon, delayed by a broken wheel, and that the Duke himself, a tall man named Sebastian Vane, had walked to the edge of the property to stretch his legs, while his driver made repairs. He had looked through the low garden wall, drawn by the sound of voices, and had seen, through the tall dining room windows lit gold with candlelight, a young woman eating crusts alone at the end of a table heavy with cake and wine and laughter that clearly was not meant to include her. He had not meant to watch. It was not his habit to look into other people's homes uninvited. But something about the scene held him there longer than he intended. The stillness of the girl's face, the way she did not flinch or protest, the way she simply endured, as if enduring were the only skill anyone had ever bothered to teach her. He noticed her hands most of all, steady and careful as she broke the bread, hands that belonged to someone who had learned patience the hard way. The Duke of Cawdry was 31 years old, unmarried, despite the constant pressure from his own mother to remedy that fact, and known throughout the county as a fair but distant man, generous with his tenants, careful with his words, and utterly unmoved by the parade of young women brought before him at every ball and dinner in hope of catching his interest. He had grown tired of performances. Every young lady he met seemed to be reciting a part written for her by an ambitious mother, and he had long since stopped believing that any of them were showing him their true selves. But the girl in the window was not performing. She did not know she was being watched, and that was precisely what made the sight so striking. There was no audience for her dignity, except him, a stranger on the road, and she carried herself with it anyway. His driver called out that the wheel was mended, and the Duke turned back toward the carriage, though he found himself glancing once more at the window before he climbed inside. He did not know the names of the family within, only the name carved into the stone gate he had passed, Bramwell Hall, and he told himself it was none of his concern. Households had their own private matters, their own arrangements, and a duke passing through on the road had no business inserting himself into a stranger's supper table. And yet the image stayed with him through the ride home, through dinner in his own vast and quiet dining hall, through the long hours after when sleep would not come. He kept seeing her hands, and the way she had not looked up even once to ask why the world had arranged itself so unfairly around her. The next morning, Eliza rose before the rest of the household, as she always did, to help Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, prepare the kitchen fires before the family woke. It was not officially her duty. She was, on paper, the daughter of the house, entitled to sleep as late as her stepsisters did. But Constance had made it clear, in the quiet, cruel way she made everything clear, that idle hands earned nothing in her house, and Eliza had found that helping in the kitchen was easier than sitting alone in her room, waiting to be summoned for some new task or scolding. Mrs. Pruitt was one of the few people in Bramwell Hall who treated Eliza with anything resembling tenderness. She was an older woman, round-faced and quick with her hands, who had worked for Eliza's father before Constance ever arrived, and who remembered the little girl who used to sit on the kitchen floor stealing bits of pastry dough. "You look tired, my dear," Mrs. Pruitt said, setting a pot over the fire. "I did not sleep well," Eliza admitted, which was true, though she could not have said exactly why. She had lain awake thinking of nothing in particular, only feeling a strange restlessness she did not have words for. "That stepmother of yours works you too hard," Mrs. Pruitt muttered, not for the first time. "Your father would not have stood for it." "My father is not here," Eliza said gently, "and there is little use wishing for what cannot be changed." It was a philosophy Eliza had built for herself over 5 long years, brick by brick, the way a person builds a wall to keep out weather they cannot control. She did not allow herself to dwell on what her life might have been if her father had lived, if Constance had never come into the house, if she had been permitted to marry for love, instead of watching her stepsisters be paraded before every eligible man in the county, while she remained in the background, unconsidered and unclaimed. She was not unattractive. She had a plain sort of prettiness, soft brown hair, and steady gray eyes, a face that people tended to call sweet rather than striking, which in the world Eliza lived in amounted to a polite way of being overlooked. Charlotte was the beauty of the family, with golden hair and a figure that turned heads at every assembly, and Diana had a sharp wit that made her popular among the young men who liked to be entertained. Eliza had neither golden hair nor sharp wit, only patience, and patience did not win husbands in a county where marriages were arranged as carefully as trade agreements. By mid-morning, word had spread through the kitchen that a carriage bearing the Cawdry crest had broken down on the road the previous evening, and that the Duke himself had been seen walking near the garden wall. The maids buzzed with the news as if a comet had passed overhead. The Duke of Cawdry rarely traveled this road, and rarer still did he linger anywhere near Bramwell Hall, whose family occupied a respectable but unremarkable place in local society, certainly not grand enough to expect visits from dukes. Constance heard the news over her morning tea, and set down her cup with unusual care. "The Duke of Cawdry," she repeated, as if testing the shape of the words, "was seen near our property." "Yes, madam," said the maid who had brought the report. His driver mentioned it to the stable boy. A wheel broke on the road, and while it was mended, His Grace walked toward the garden wall. Constance's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, toward Charlotte, who was seated by the window arranging flowers with an air of practiced grace. A slow, calculating warmth spread across the stepmother's face, the particular warmth of a woman who has just glimpsed an opportunity worth pursuing. "How fortunate," Constance said, "that our garden was in such good order for him to see." Eliza, standing near the doorway with a tray of teacups, said nothing. She understood immediately what her stepmother was already imagining. A chance meeting turned into a courtship turned into a match that would elevate the entire family. It did not occur to Constance, not even for a moment, that the Duke's gaze might have fallen anywhere near Eliza. Why would it? Eliza was the quiet one, the plain one, the one kept at the edges of every gathering like a chair no one wished to sit in. It should not have stung. Eliza told herself this as she carried the tray into the sitting room, that she had no right to feel anything at all about a duke she had never met, and likely never would meet, a man who did not know her name, and had certainly not so much as glanced through the dining room window the previous night. She told herself this, and yet some small, foolish part of her chest ached anyway, the way it always did when she was reminded, yet again, that she was invisible, even in her own imagination. The days that followed brought no further sign of the Duke, and the household's excitement gradually settled back into its usual rhythms. Constance began, with typical efficiency, to plan a small dinner she hoped might draw notice from Cawdry society, inviting families she believed carried influence. ordering new gowns for Charlotte and Diana, rehearsing conversation topics she thought might impress a duke, should he ever cross their threshold again. Eliza was given the task of managing the household accounts for the event, adding columns of numbers late into the night by candlelight, while her stepsisters slept soundly upstairs. She did not resent the work itself. She had always been good with numbers, better than either of her stepsisters, and there was a strange comfort in the orderliness of figures, the way they added up honestly no matter who was doing the counting. What she resented, quietly and privately, was the reminder that every plan made in this house was made for someone else's benefit. The dinner, should it succeed in drawing the Duke's attention, would be a triumph for Charlotte or Diana, never for her. She would stand at the edges again, pouring tea, refilling glasses, present but unseen, a shadow attending her own family's rise. She did not yet know that the Duke of Cawdry had thought of her more than once since that evening on the road, that he had asked his steward, in a tone he tried to make sound casual, whether he knew anything of the family at Bramwell Hall. She did not know that Sebastian Vane had learned the name of the household, had learned there was a daughter from the late Edmund Bramwell's first marriage, and had felt a small, unexpected tug of curiosity he could not quite explain to himself. She only knew that she had bread while others had cake, and that this was simply the shape of her life, and that no amount of wishing would change it. But change, unannounced and unseen, was already moving toward Bramwell Hall, carried on the same road where a wheel had broken, and a duke had paused to look through a window he had no right to look through, and had seen, in one quiet, unguarded moment, a girl who deserved far more than the crusts she was given. The dinner Constance planned was set for a fortnight later, and in the days leading up to it, the house buzzed with a nervous, busy energy that touched every room except the small chamber where Eliza slept. She continued her early mornings in the kitchen, her long afternoons balancing accounts, her quiet evenings at the foot of the table, and if anyone had asked her whether she hoped the Duke might attend, she would have said, truthfully, that she hoped only for the dinner to pass without incident, because incidents in this house always seemed to land on her shoulders, no matter their cause. She did not yet understand that she had already been seen, truly seen, in a way none of her family had ever managed in 5 long years of sharing a roof with her. She did not know that somewhere across the county, a duke who had everything a man could want was thinking of a girl with steady hands and quiet dignity, and wondering how he might find a proper reason to see her again. The invitation to the Duke of Cawdry arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a footman in fine livery who handed the sealed letter to Constance, with the sort of ceremony usually reserved for royalty. Constance had not actually invited the Duke herself, not directly, knowing such boldness might seem improper for a family of modest standing. Instead, she had invited Lord Alaric Penrose, a friend of the Duke's known to visit Cawdry often, and had mentioned, with careful casualness, that her dinner would be graced by several notable families of the county. It was Lord Penrose, as it turned out, who mentioned the dinner to Sebastian Vane over cards one evening, and to the surprise of everyone who knew him, the Duke expressed an interest in attending. He told himself it was simple curiosity. He wanted, he reasoned, only to see the household again in daylight, to satisfy himself that the strange, lingering image from that evening on the road had been nothing more than a trick of candlelight and an idle mind. A man as busy as he was could not afford to be distracted by a stranger glimpsed through a window, and yet when the evening of the dinner arrived, he found himself dressing with more care than usual, and riding toward Bramwell Hall with a restlessness he did not care to examine too closely. Constance nearly wept with joy when the Duke's carriage rolled up the drive. She had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing for this exact possibility, though she had not truly believed it would happen. She rushed Charlotte and Diana to their places by the drawing-room window, arranged them like figures in a portrait, and issued Eliza a long list of tasks meant to keep her occupied and out of sight for the evening, refilling wine glasses, directing the kitchen staff, seeing to the needs of guests who required nothing at all. "You will manage the back rooms tonight," Constance told her, not unkindly, simply as a matter of fact, the way one might instruct a servant. The guests do not need to be troubled by unfamiliar faces. Eliza did not argue. She rarely did. She simply nodded and went to check on the kitchen, where Mrs. Pruitt was overseeing a roast that smelled better than anything Eliza herself would likely taste that evening, since the family always ate first and the staff made do with whatever remained. The dinner began well by every measure that mattered to Constance. The Duke was polite, attentive, and complimentary of the meal, and Charlotte, seated beside him at Constance's careful arrangement, spoke with the practiced charm she had been cultivating since she was old enough to understand that charm was a currency. Diana laughed at all the right moments and asked questions designed to make the Duke feel admired without seeming to flatter him too obviously. By every visible sign, the evening was a triumph. But Sebastian Vane found his attention wandering. Charlotte's conversation, though pleasant enough, felt rehearsed to him, each sentence arriving with the polish of something practiced in front of a mirror. Diana's laughter, though musical, seemed to arrive a half-second too quickly after his own words, as if she were waiting for her cue rather than genuinely amused. He answered their questions, complimented the meal, played his part as a guest should, and all the while some part of his mind kept drifting toward the kitchen doorway, where he had briefly glimpsed a young woman with soft brown hair, carrying a tray, before disappearing again, quick and quiet as a passing thought. It was later in the evening, when the guests had moved from the dining room to the drawing room for cards and conversation, that he found his opportunity. He excused himself, claiming a need for air, and instead of stepping onto the terrace as the other guests assumed, he wandered toward the back of the house, drawn by nothing more than instinct and an unwillingness to let the evening end without answering the question that had followed him for 2 restless weeks. He found her in a small side room near the kitchen, sitting alone at a narrow table, adding figures into a ledger by the light of a single candle, while the sounds of laughter and music drifted faintly from the front of the house. She looked up when the door opened, startled, and rose quickly, smoothing her skirts as though caught doing something wrong, though she had done nothing but her assigned work. "Forgive me," Sebastian said, and found himself oddly unsure of what to say next, a rare feeling for a man usually so composed. "I did not mean to intrude. I was told the terrace was this way, and I seem to have lost myself in your hallways." It was not entirely true, and something in his tone suggested he knew it was not entirely true, but Eliza did not press the matter. She was too startled by his presence to think of much beyond simple courtesy. "The terrace is at the front of the house, Your Grace," she said, dropping into a careful curtsy, "through the drawing room, and to the left." "Thank you," he said, though he made no move to leave. His eyes had settled on the ledger open before her, the neat columns of figures, the careful, steady handwriting. "You are managing the household accounts." "Yes, Your Grace." "That seems a great deal of responsibility for an evening meant for celebration." Eliza allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the first genuine one that had crossed her face in days. "Someone must keep the numbers honest, Your Grace, even during a celebration. Perhaps especially during a celebration." Something in her tone, dry and quietly amused, caught him off guard, and he found himself smiling in return, before he had quite decided to. It was the first unguarded exchange he had had all evening, more honest in its simplicity than anything Charlotte or Diana had offered him, over an entire meal of careful conversation. "You have the advantage of me," he said. "You know my title, and I do not yet know your name." "Eliza Bramwell, Your Grace. My father built this house." He studied her for a moment, something shifting behind his eyes as the pieces settled into place. This was the girl from the window, the one eating crusts while cake went uneaten around her. He understood now, with a clarity that unsettled him slightly, that she was not a servant at all but a daughter of the house, kept in the shadows of her own home, by choices that were not hers to make. "Bramwell," he repeated. "Then you are Lady Constance's stepdaughter." "I am," Eliza said, and something in her posture straightened slightly, a quiet bracing against whatever judgment might follow. It was a common enough reaction when people learned the truth of her position in the household. A flicker of surprise followed, more often than not, by pity or dismissal. But Sebastian offered neither. He only nodded, as though filing the information away with care, and said, "You manage the accounts well." I noticed no error in the columns as I glanced at them. "You looked at my figures, Your Grace, without my permission," Eliza said, and though her tone remained perfectly respectful, there was a flash of dry humor beneath it that made him laugh, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle even him. "I did," he admitted. "A poor habit of mine. I apologize." "I forgive you, Your Grace, on the condition that you find your way to the terrace before you are missed." He should have gone then. Every rule of propriety he had been raised with, told him to leave the room immediately, to return to the guests waiting for him, to not linger a moment longer in a private conversation with an unmarried young woman he had only just met. And yet he lingered anyway, asking her a handful of small questions about the house, about her father, about how she had come to be so skilled with figures, and she answered each one with a careful, measured honesty that impressed him more than any rehearsed charm could have. When he finally did leave, walking the long way back to the drawing room so that no one would guess where he had been, he carried with him a feeling he had not expected to find at a dinner he had attended, out of nothing more than idle curiosity. It was the distinct, unsettling sense that he had just met someone entirely unlike anyone else in that house, someone who did not know how to perform, only how to endure, and who had made him laugh without trying to at all. For the remainder of the evening, he was attentive to Charlotte and Diana in the way propriety demanded, complimenting their conversation, thanking Constance for her hospitality, behaving in every visible way like a man who had enjoyed himself thoroughly among the family's finest company. Constance, watching him with a hawk's careful eye, believed she saw the beginnings of real interest, and could not decide, with growing excitement, whether it was Charlotte's beauty or Diana's wit that had captured him. It did not occur to her, not even for a passing second, that the true object of his thoughts had spent the entire evening in the back rooms of the house, unseen and unconsidered by everyone but him. Eliza returned to her ledger once the door closed behind him, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to resume her work, though the numbers seemed to blur before her eyes. She told herself, firmly, that it had been nothing, a duke being polite to a stray member of the household he had stumbled upon by accident, a kindness extended out of good manners rather than genuine interest. Men like the Duke of Cawdry did not concern themselves with girls like her, girls who ate crusts at the foot of the table and managed the household accounts because no one else wanted the task. And yet she found herself, later that night, lying awake in her narrow bed, replaying the sound of his laugh, and wondering, against every warning her own good sense offered her, whether she might see him again. She did not have to wonder long. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Bramwell Hall, addressed not to Constance, not to Charlotte, not to Diana, but to Miss Eliza Bramwell, sealed with the crest of the Duke of Cawdry. Constance intercepted the letter before Eliza ever saw it, as she intercepted most things addressed to her stepdaughter, believing it her right as mistress of the house to know the contents of any correspondence that crossed her threshold. She turned the sealed envelope over in her hands twice, studying the crest, the fine paper, the careful script of her stepdaughter's name, and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle in her chest, a feeling she did not yet have a name for, but would soon recognize as fear. She did not open it. Whatever her faults, and they were many, Constance understood that tampering with a letter bearing a duke's seal was a risk not worth taking, should its contents ever be questioned. Instead, she carried it to Eliza's small room herself, something she had not done in years, and handed it over with an expression that was trying very hard to look unconcerned and failing entirely. "This arrived for you," Constance said, watching closely as Eliza broke the seal. The letter was brief, formal, and entirely proper, the kind of letter that could be read aloud in any drawing room, without a single eyebrow raised. The Duke of Cawdry wrote that he had learned, through casual conversation with Lord Penrose, that Bramwell Hall's stores of grain had suffered somewhat in the recent harvest, and that he wished to offer, as a neighborly courtesy, a portion of surplus from the Cawdry estate to assist the tenant families under Bramwell's care. He requested that Miss Eliza Bramwell, whom he understood managed the household's practical affairs, meet with his steward to arrange the details, at her convenience, at the boundary between the two estates. It was, on its surface, nothing more than a matter of business, the kind of exchange that happened between neighboring estates often enough. And yet Constance read it twice more, searching for something beneath the words that she could not quite name, some deeper meaning she felt certain must be hiding there. "How very generous of His Grace," Constance said slowly, "to concern himself with our tenant families." "Yes, madam," Eliza said, folding the letter carefully. "I will arrange the meeting as he requests." "I will send Charlotte with you," Constance said quickly. "It would not be proper for you to meet a duke's steward unaccompanied." Eliza knew better than to argue, though she suspected, correctly, that Constance's concern had less to do with propriety, and more to do with ensuring that any credit for the arrangement, and any attention it might draw from the Duke, would land on Charlotte's shoulders rather than her own. It did not matter to Eliza. She had long ago stopped competing for credit in a household where credit was never given to her, regardless of how it was earned. The meeting at the boundary between the estates took place 3 days later, on a cool morning, with mist still clinging to the low fields. Charlotte arrived, dressed as though attending a ball rather than a business meeting, her golden curls arranged with careful precision, clearly hoping the Duke himself might appear rather than merely his steward. When only the steward arrived, a quiet, efficient man named Mr. Fairweather, Charlotte's enthusiasm visibly deflated, and she spent the remainder of the meeting complaining softly about the cold, while Eliza handled the actual arrangements, discussing quantities and delivery schedules, with the same careful precision she brought to her household ledgers. Mr. Fairweather, observing this division of labor with the sharp eyes of a man who had served the Cawdry family for many years, said little, but he reported back to his employer that evening, with more detail than the arrangement strictly required. The younger stepdaughter did nothing but complain of the cold, he told the Duke. It was Miss Eliza who arranged everything, quickly and sensibly, without a single wasted word. She thanked me twice for the trouble, though the trouble was entirely His Grace's idea, and none of my own. Sebastian found himself smiling at this report in a way that made Fairweather, who had known him since boyhood, raise an eyebrow but say nothing further. Over the following weeks, small occasions arose, each one appearing entirely reasonable on its own, that brought Eliza and Sebastian into contact again. A charity effort for tenant families displaced by flooding required coordination between the two estates, and it was somehow always Eliza who was sent to manage the details on behalf of Bramwell Hall, since Constance had quickly grown bored of the tedious practical matters involved, and Charlotte and Diana had no patience for accounting or logistics. A church fundraiser brought both families into the same room for an afternoon, and Sebastian found himself seeking out Eliza's company at the refreshment table, rather than joining the cluster of young ladies competing for his attention near the piano. He was careful, always careful, never allowing his interest to become obvious enough to draw comment, aware that a duke's attention, once noticed, could bring consequences for a young woman not yet ready to face them. But in small ways, quiet ways, that no one else seemed to notice, he began to look out for her. When he learned, through careful and roundabout questioning of Mrs. Pruitt during a visit to inspect a shared boundary fence, that Eliza rarely received a full portion at her own family's table, he arranged, without explanation, for extra provisions to be delivered to Bramwell Hall's kitchen, under the guise of a general neighborly gift, ensuring Mrs. Pruitt understood, with a private word and a coin pressed into her palm, that a certain portion should always find its way to Eliza's plate, regardless of what happened at the main table. When he heard, from a passing comment at another gathering, that Charlotte had mocked Eliza's mended gown in front of several guests, he made a point, the very next time he saw Eliza at a public event, of complimenting her appearance with such genuine warmth and specificity that several of the other guests turned to look, and Charlotte's mocking comments about mended hems dried up rather quickly after that, unwilling to risk contradicting a duke's stated opinion. Eliza noticed these small kindnesses, though she was slow to trust them. 5 years of careful disappointment had taught her not to expect good things to last, and she found herself waiting, almost against her will, for the moment when Sebastian's attention would prove to be nothing more than a passing curiosity, easily replaced by someone prettier or better positioned. And yet the kindnesses continued, steady and quiet, never demanding anything in return, never drawing attention to themselves in a way that might embarrass her. It was during a walk along the estate boundary, ostensibly to discuss the placement of a new fence, that Sebastian finally asked her about her father. "He built this house with his own plans," Eliza said, looking out over the fields that had once belonged entirely to her family, before Constance's arrival brought new claims upon them. "He was not born to wealth, Your Grace. He earned it, through trade, through careful decisions, through years of work most gentlemen of his later standing would never have lowered themselves to do. He wanted me to understand the value of things, not simply inherit them without knowing their cost." "And your stepmother?" Eliza was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "My stepmother married my father 2 years before he died. I do not believe she loved him, not truly, though I cannot say for certain what was in her heart. I believe she loved the house, and the name, and the security it offered her daughters. When my father died, she found herself in possession of everything she had married for, and very little use for the daughter who came attached to it. That must have been difficult, Sebastian said quietly. It was, Eliza admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. She rarely spoke so plainly about her circumstances, even to Mrs. Pruitt, who already knew most of it. There was something about Sebastian's quiet attention, the way he listened without interrupting, without rushing to offer sympathy she had not asked for, that made honesty feel safe in a way it rarely did. But difficulty is not the same as tragedy, Your Grace. I have a roof over my head, and work to occupy my hands. Many have far less. You are generous in your assessment of your own suffering, Sebastian said. Most people, I think, would not be so quick to minimize it. What use is dwelling on it? Eliza asked, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time since they had met. I cannot change my stepmother's heart, and I cannot bring my father back. I can only decide, each day, how I will carry what has been given to me. Bitterness is heavy, Your Grace. I have found I would rather not carry it, on top of everything else. Sebastian said nothing for a long moment, only watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between admiration and something deeper, something he had not yet found a name for himself. He had met countless young women in his years as a duke, all of them polished, all of them eager to please him, and not one of them had ever spoken to him with such unguarded, unpolished honesty. It struck him, standing in that cold field with the wind pulling at her plain wool cloak, that he had never in his life admired anyone quite so much. But their growing acquaintance had not gone entirely unnoticed. Constance, sharp-eyed despite her self-absorption, had begun to notice a pattern in the frequency of Eliza's involvement in matters that brought her near the Duke. And though she could not quite believe what she was seeing, a small seed of suspicion had taken root and begun, slowly, to grow. It is strange, Constance said one evening, watching Eliza return from another errand related to the tenant charity. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, and something else Constance could not quite identify. How often you seem to be the one sent to deal with matters concerning the Duke's estate. Someone must manage the details, madam, Eliza said carefully. Charlotte and Diana have expressed little interest in the practical arrangements. Perhaps, Constance said, her eyes narrowing slightly, you have taken rather too much interest in them yourself. Eliza did not answer, understanding the danger in the question, and Constance did not press further that evening. But the seed had been planted, and in the weeks that followed, it grew steadily, watered by small observations that Constance filed away one by one. The way the Duke's steward always seemed to ask specifically for Eliza when arrangements needed making, the way Sebastian's eyes seemed to search the room for her at gatherings before settling, with visible effort, on Charlotte or Diana instead, the way Eliza's cheeks colored slightly whenever his name was mentioned at the family table. Charlotte noticed too, though her jealousy took longer to fully form, distracted as she was by her own confidence that the Duke's interest, whatever its object, must surely land on her in the end. It was Diana, sharper and more observant than her sister, who first voiced the suspicion aloud, during a private conversation between the two stepsisters one evening after Eliza had retired. Have you noticed, Diana said, brushing out her hair before the mirror, how often our stepsister's name comes up whenever the Duke of Cawdry is mentioned? She manages the household accounts, Charlotte said dismissively. It is natural that practical matters fall to her. Perhaps, Diana said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. But I have seen the way he looks toward the doorway when she enters a room. It is not the look of a man distracted by household accounts. Charlotte's laugh was sharp and a little too loud. Eliza, you cannot be serious. She wears mended gowns and eats crusts at supper. The Duke of Cawdry could have any woman in the county. He would not look twice at a girl like her. But even as she said it, a small, unwelcome doubt had begun to form in Charlotte's mind, and that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself thinking of her quiet, overlooked stepsister with something other than casual contempt. It was a new and uncomfortable feeling, and Charlotte did not yet know what she intended to do about it, only that she did not intend to sit quietly and watch her own future slip away to a girl who ate crusts at the foot of the table. The confrontation came on the evening of the county assembly, an annual gathering held in the largest hall in town, where every family of consequence for miles around came together for dancing, conversation, and the kind of careful social maneuvering that determined marriages for years to come. Constance had prepared for this evening with more care than she had shown for anything in months, determined that whichever of her daughters the Duke favored, that daughter would be dressed, positioned, and presented in a manner impossible for him to overlook. Eliza had not expected to attend at all. Constance rarely included her in such events, preferring to leave her behind to manage household matters, while the rest of the family enjoyed the evening's entertainments. But this year, unexpectedly, Constance insisted she come, and Eliza understood, without needing to be told directly, that her stepmother wanted her present, precisely so she could be watched. Her every interaction with the Duke observed and controlled. The assembly hall glittered with candlelight and the rustle of silk gowns, and Eliza, dressed in a simple gown that had been remade from an older one of Diana's, felt every bit the outsider she had always been in such gatherings. She kept to the edges of the room, as she always did, watching the dancing from a distance, and told herself firmly that she did not mind, that she had never minded, that watching from the edges was simply the role she had been assigned, and there was no use resenting it now. But Sebastian found her within the first half hour, making his way through the crowd with the kind of quiet purpose that drew no attention, precisely because he was so practiced at appearing casual. He asked her to dance, and though every instinct told her to refuse, to protect herself from the attention such a request would draw, something in his steady gaze made refusal impossible. They danced once, only once, but it was enough. The room noticed. Whispers moved through the crowd, like wind through wheat, and Constance, watching from across the hall with a fixed smile that did not reach her eyes, felt the careful fiction she had built for herself finally begin to crack. It was not Charlotte the Duke had chosen for his single dance of the evening, not Diana, but Eliza. Plain, quiet, overlooked Eliza, and the realization struck Constance with a force that left her briefly unable to speak. When the dance ended, and Sebastian escorted Eliza back toward the edge of the room, bowing over her hand, with a warmth that was impossible to mistake for mere politeness, Constance moved quickly, intercepting them both before Sebastian could withdraw. "Your Grace is too generous with his attention tonight," Constance said, her voice pitched carefully between playfulness and warning. "My stepdaughter has many household duties awaiting her. I would not wish to keep her from them." "I am certain the household duties can spare her for one dance, Lady Bramwell," Sebastian said evenly, and something in his tone, calm but unmistakably firm, made Constance's smile falter slightly. "Of course," Constance said, recovering quickly. "Though I confess I am surprised, Your Grace. Eliza is a sweet girl, but hardly accustomed to such company. I would hate for her to feel out of her depth." It was a cruelty disguised as concern, the kind Constance had perfected over years of practice, and Eliza felt the familiar sting of it, made sharper by the fact that it was delivered in front of the one person whose good opinion had, without her quite realizing it, come to matter to her a great deal. "I have found Miss Bramwell entirely equal to any company she keeps," Sebastian said, and there was something in his voice now that carried further than perhaps he intended, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "I have rarely met anyone so capable of managing both figures and conversation with equal skill." Constance's composure slipped further, a flush of anger rising in her cheeks that she struggled to disguise as pleasure. "How kind of you to say so, Your Grace. Eliza has always been diligent, if perhaps a touch too plain in her manner for polished company. I find plainness, when it is honest, far more valuable than polish that hides poor character," Sebastian said, and though his tone remained perfectly courteous, the words landed with the weight of a rebuke. It was Charlotte who intervened next, drawn by the tension she sensed building near the edge of the dance floor, and her arrival brought with it a different kind of danger, one born not of Constance's careful cruelty, but of Charlotte's wounded pride finally breaking loose from whatever restraint had held it. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, forcing brightness into her voice, "I do hope you will save the next dance for me. I have been practicing a new step I think you would find amusing." "Perhaps later, Miss Bramwell," Sebastian said politely, but his eyes did not leave Eliza's face, and Charlotte, watching the exchange with growing humiliation, felt something inside her finally snap. "I do not understand," Charlotte said, her voice rising slightly, drawing more attention than she perhaps intended. "Why Eliza should occupy so much of your evening, Your Grace. She has no dowry to speak of, no real position in society beyond what our family charitably grants her. Surely there are more suitable companions for a man of your standing." The words fell into a small, sudden silence, several nearby conversations pausing, as guests turned to observe the unfolding scene. Eliza felt her face burn, the old familiar humiliation rushing back with a force that made her want to disappear entirely, to become invisible again, the way she had trained herself to be for 5 long years. But this time, unlike every other time, the humiliation was witnessed not just by her family, but by half the assembly hall, and by the one person she had begun, foolishly, to hope might see her as something more than the quiet stepdaughter who ate crusts and managed household ledgers. Sebastian's expression, however, did not shift into the embarrassed retreat Charlotte had perhaps expected. Instead, something cold and controlled settled over his features, a look those who knew him well would have recognized as the particular quiet fury he reserved for genuine injustice. "Miss Bramwell's-worth," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent circle of guests, "is not measured by a dowry, nor by the charity of a family who seems to have forgotten what it owes her. She managed this household's accounts, while her stepsisters enjoyed leisure she was denied. She arranged charity for tenant families, while receiving none of the credit due her. She has shown more genuine character in the handful of conversations I have had with her than I have witnessed in a great many drawing rooms filled with far more polished company." The silence that followed was absolute. Constance's face had gone pale, then red, caught between fury and the sudden, terrible awareness that she had badly misjudged the situation, that whatever fragile fiction she had built about the Duke's intentions had just been demolished in front of every family of consequence in the county. Charlotte stood frozen. Her earlier confidence collapsed entirely into humiliation of her own, the kind she had spent years inflicting on others, and had never once expected to feel herself. Eliza, for her part, wanted nothing more than to leave the hall entirely, to escape the weight of every eye now turned toward her, some curious, some pitying, some newly speculative. But before she could move, Sebastian turned to her, his expression softening from the controlled anger he had shown Charlotte into something gentler, something that made the crowded room seem, briefly, to fall away entirely. "Forgive me," he said quietly, for her ears alone, though the words still carried in the hush. "I should not have spoken so publicly, but I find I can no longer stand by while you are diminished in front of me, Miss Bramwell, whatever the cost to propriety." Eliza did not know how to answer. Her heart was pounding, her face still burning, and beneath the humiliation of the moment ran a current of something else entirely, something warm and frightening and entirely unfamiliar, the sense that for the first time in 5 long years, someone had stood between her and the world that had always been so willing to diminish her, and had chosen, without hesitation, to defend her instead. She managed only a small, unsteady curtsy before Constance, recovering some measure of composure, seized her arm and steered her firmly toward the door, muttering something about the evening air and needing to depart early. Charlotte and Diana followed close behind, and the carriage ride home passed in a silence so thick it felt almost physical, broken only by Constance's occasional sharp intake of breath, as though she were composing and discarding a dozen furious speeches, before finally settling on none of them at all. It was not until they arrived home, the front door closing behind them with a heavy finality, that Constance finally spoke, her voice low and trembling with barely contained anger. "You have humiliated this family," she said, turning on Eliza, with an expression Eliza had never seen before, something beyond her usual cold disdain, something closer to genuine hatred. "Do you understand what you have done? Charlotte's prospects, Diana's prospects, everything I have worked to build for this family, and you have thrown it into chaos with your quiet games and your stolen attention." "I have played no games, madam," Eliza said, her voice trembling but holding steady. "I did not seek His Grace's attention. I have done nothing but the tasks you assigned me. And somehow those tasks have left you standing in the middle of the county assembly, while a duke declares your character superior to my own daughter's, in front of everyone who matters in this county," Constance said, her voice rising now, no longer bothering to disguise her fury. "You will not see him again. Do you understand me? Whatever foolish attachment has formed between you, it ends tonight. I will not have you destroy this family's standing, for the sake of your own vanity." "Vanity," Eliza repeated softly, and something in her, Some long-buried spark of her father's stubbornness finally rose to the surface after years of careful suppression. "I have eaten crusts at your table for 5 years, madam, while your daughters feasted on cake and never once offered me a crumb. I have managed your accounts, run your household, and asked for nothing in return but to be left in peace. If a duke has finally seen some worth in me, that this family has spent 5 years pretending did not exist, I will not apologize for it." Constance's hand rose, and for one terrible moment, Eliza believed she meant to strike her. But instead, Constance simply pointed toward the stairs, her voice gone cold and flat, with something more dangerous than anger, something calculating and final. "Go to your room," she said. "We will discuss your future in the morning, and I promise you, Eliza, it will not include the Duke of Cawdry." Eliza climbed the stairs alone, her legs trembling, the weight of the evening pressing down on her, with a force that made breathing difficult. She had spent 5 years learning to endure, to accept the shape of her narrowed life without complaint, and now, in a single evening, everything she had carefully accepted had been thrown into question. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, only that the fragile peace she had built for herself, brick by careful brick, had just been shattered beyond repair, and she had no way of knowing whether what waited on the other side of that shattering would be better or infinitely worse. Morning brought no softening in Constance's resolve. She summoned Eliza to the drawing room before breakfast, before Charlotte and Diana had even woken, and laid out her plans with the cold efficiency of a woman who had spent the night calculating rather than sleeping. "You will go to stay with my sister in the north," Constance announced, not looking up from the letter she was already composing. "She has need of a companion, and the distance will serve everyone well. You will leave within the week." "You mean to send me away?" Eliza said quietly, though it was not truly a question. "I mean to protect this family's interests," Constance corrected. "Whatever fantasy has taken root in your mind about the Duke of Cawdry, it ends now. A man in his position does not marry stepdaughters with mended gowns and no dowry, whatever pretty words he offered last night. He was defending you out of momentary chivalry, nothing more, and you would be a fool to mistake it for anything deeper. Better you learn that lesson now, far from here, than suffer a far greater humiliation when his interest inevitably fades." There was a certain cruel logic to Constance's words, and Eliza, standing there in the cold morning light, felt the old familiar doubt creep back in, the doubt that had kept her small and quiet for 5 long years. Perhaps Constance was right. Perhaps Sebastian's defense of her had been nothing more than a momentary impulse, forgotten by the light of day, and perhaps agreeing to leave quietly would spare her the far greater pain of hoping for something that would never come. But even as the doubt rose, so did something else. Something her father's stubbornness had planted in her long ago, and that the events of the previous evening had watered into new growth. She thought of Sebastian's voice, cutting through the silence of the assembly hall, steady and certain, defending her worth without hesitation or calculation. She thought of the small kindnesses that had accumulated over weeks, the extra provisions at the table, the compliment that had silenced Charlotte's mockery, the patient way he had listened to her speak of her father, without once looking away. These were not the actions of a man engaged in momentary chivalry. These were the careful, deliberate actions of a man who had chosen, again and again, to see her. "I will not go north, madam," Eliza said, and her voice, though quiet, did not waver. Constance's head snapped up from her letter, genuine shock crossing her features, as though the possibility of refusal had simply never occurred to her. "You will do as you are told. I am your guardian, Eliza, and you have no independent means. You will go where I send you." "I am 19 years old," Eliza said, "and my father left this house to me in trust, to pass fully into my keeping upon my majority, or my marriage, whichever comes first. I have seen the papers, madam, in the study, though you perhaps believed I never would. You have managed the estate in my name these 5 years, and managed it well enough, but it was never truly yours to give away, nor mine to be sent from as though I were a servant, with no claim to the roof over my own head." The color drained from Constance's face, replaced by something colder and more dangerous, the look of a woman who had just realized her careful control over a situation had been an illusion all along. "You would not dare," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You have no funds of your own, no allies, No one who would take your word over mine. It was at that precise moment, as though summoned by the tension in the room, that the sound of a carriage arriving on the drive reached them through the window, and moments later, a footman announced, with barely concealed excitement, that the Duke of Cawdry had arrived and requested an audience with Lady Bramwell and Miss Eliza Bramwell both. Sebastian entered the drawing room with an air of quiet, controlled purpose, dressed with more formality than his usual visits required, and behind him followed Mr. Fairweather, carrying a leather portfolio of papers that seemed to make Constance visibly uneasy the moment she saw it. "Your Grace," Constance said, recovering her composure with visible effort, forcing warmth into a voice that had moments earlier been cold with threat. "This is an unexpected honor. Please, sit. I will have tea brought." "I will not stay long, Lady Bramwell," Sebastian said, remaining standing, his eyes moving briefly to Eliza, taking in the paleness of her face, the tightness around her eyes that spoke of a difficult morning. "I have come on a matter of some importance, and I would prefer to address it plainly, rather than over tea." "Of course," Constance said, though her hands had begun to twist together in her lap, a small betraying gesture she seemed unaware of. "I have made inquiries," Sebastian said, "regarding the late Edmund Bramwell's will and the terms of his estate. I confess I did so out of concern following last evening's events, and what I discovered troubled me enough that I felt compelled to act." Mr. Fairweather stepped forward and opened the portfolio, producing a document that he placed on the table between them. "The will is quite clear, Lady Bramwell," he said, his tone perfectly professional, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Bramwell Hall and its associated income were left in trust for Miss Eliza Bramwell, to be managed by her stepmother, only until Miss Bramwell's 20th birthday, or her marriage, whichever occurs first. Miss Bramwell will turn 20 in a matter of weeks, at which point full control of the estate passes to her entirely, regardless of any other arrangement made in the interim." Constance stared at the document, as though it might change its contents if she looked at it hard enough. "This is a private family matter," she said finally, her voice tight. "I do not see what business it is of yours, Your Grace." "It became my business," Sebastian said evenly, "when I learned that the rightful heir to this estate has spent 5 years eating crusts at her own table, while denied the comfort and respect owed to her, and when I discovered, only this morning, through inquiries I made after last night's assembly, that you intended to send her away before her 20th birthday arrived, effectively removing her from the property before she could claim what is legally hers." The accusation landed in the silent room like a struck bell, and Constance's face, already pale, went ashen. Charlotte and Diana, who had crept to the doorway at the sound of raised voices, stood frozen, their earlier jealousy suddenly overshadowed by the far larger crisis unfolding before them. "I do not know what you mean," Constance said, though her voice had lost all conviction. "I believe you do," Sebastian said, and though his tone remained controlled, there was steel beneath it now. "I have spoken with the solicitor who handled Edmund Bramwell's estate. He confirms the terms exactly as Mr. Fairweather has described them. He also confirmed that he had received, within the past week, an inquiry from you regarding the process for extending guardianship arrangements beyond a ward's 20th birthday under certain circumstances that would require the ward's absence or incapacity to be established. I will not speculate further on what you intended, Lady Bramwell, only observe that the timing is troubling." Eliza, who had remained silent through the entire exchange, felt something shift inside her, a lifetime of careful acceptance finally giving way to a clearer understanding of just how precarious her position had truly been, and how close she had come to losing everything without ever fully realizing the danger. She looked at Constance, searching for some sign of denial, some explanation that might soften the accusation, but found only guilt written plainly across her stepmother's face. "I did what I believed necessary," Constance said finally, her voice small now, stripped of its usual commanding coldness. "This house, this family, everything I built here depended on stability. I could not risk Eliza's inexperience undoing years of careful management. I meant only to protect what I had worked to maintain." "You meant to protect your own daughter's prospects," Sebastian said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth of it, at the expense of a young woman who trusted you with her father's legacy and received in return 5 years of neglect and cruelty. I do not say this to punish you further, Lady Bramwell. I say it because Miss Bramwell deserves to hear the truth spoken plainly, perhaps for the first time in years. Constance said nothing further, her composure finally, completely broken, and in the silence that followed, Sebastian turned to Eliza, his expression softening entirely from the controlled formality he had shown her stepmother. "I did not come here only to address the matter of the estate," he said quietly, "though I could not, in good conscience, allow the injustice to continue unaddressed. I came because after last night, I could not bear the thought of you being sent away before I had the chance to speak plainly, without an audience, without the constraints of propriety weighing on every word." Eliza's heart was pounding so hard she was certain the entire room must hear it. "Your Grace," she began, uncertain what words might follow, but he shook his head gently, asking silently for the chance to finish. "I have spent 31 years being courted for my title, my fortune, my position, by women who performed versions of themselves they believed I wished to see," he said. "I had begun to believe that genuine connection, honest and unperformed, was simply not available to a man in my position. And then I saw you through a window, eating crusts while your family feasted, enduring an injustice with more quiet dignity than I have seen in any drawing room in this county. I did not fall in love with you that evening, Miss Bramwell. I do not believe love arrives so quickly, whatever the poets claim. But something in me recognized, even then, that you were someone worth knowing properly, and every conversation since has only confirmed what I first suspected. You are honest where others perform. You endure where others complain. You have carried an unjust burden for 5 years, without once allowing it to make you bitter or cruel in return, and I find that I admire you more than I have admired anyone in my life." He paused, and in the silence, Eliza became aware that Charlotte and Diana had gone entirely still in the doorway, and that even Constance had stopped her nervous twisting of hands to listen. "I am not asking you to decide anything today," Sebastian continued. "You have had a difficult morning, and I would not add to that difficulty by demanding an answer before you are ready to give one. I ask only that you allow me to continue, knowing you properly, without your stepmother's interference, and without the constraints that have kept you hidden away for so long. Whatever comes of it, I want you to know that you are not without allies, Miss Bramwell. Not any longer." Eliza found, to her own surprise, that she was crying. Quiet tears, that she made no effort to hide. Tears born not of sadness, but of something she had almost forgotten how to feel. The overwhelming relief of being truly seen after years of careful invisibility. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed finally, "for seeing what no one else in this house cared to notice." "It was never difficult to see," Sebastian said gently. "It was only difficult to understand why everyone else had chosen to look away." He remained a while longer, discussing practical matters with Mr. Fairweather regarding the formal transfer of the estate once Eliza's 20th birthday arrived, ensuring that proper legal safeguards were put in place to protect her interests in the interim. Constance sat through the remainder of the visit in near silence, her earlier commanding presence entirely deflated, and by the time Sebastian's carriage finally departed down the long drive, the entire household had shifted on its foundations in a way that would prove impossible to reverse. Eliza stood at the window long after the carriage disappeared from view, watching the empty road with a strange, unfamiliar feeling rising in her chest, something that felt almost like hope, cautious and fragile, but undeniably present, the first genuine hope she had allowed herself to feel in 5 long years. The weeks that followed Eliza's 20th birthday brought changes to Bramwell Hall that none of its residents could have predicted only a season earlier. With the estate legally passed into her hands, guided carefully by Mr. Fairweather and a solicitor of her own choosing, Eliza found herself, for the first time in her life, the true mistress of her father's house, with the authority to shape it as she saw fit. She did not choose cruelty, though she would have been forgiven for it after everything she had endured. Instead, she chose something quieter and, in its own way, far more powerful. She informed Constance that she would continue to have a home at Bramwell Hall, provided her conduct reflected the respect due to its rightful mistress, but that the household would now run on terms of fairness rather than favoritism. Charlotte and Diana, accustomed to a lifetime of privilege at Eliza's expense, found the adjustment difficult, but Eliza, unlike her stepmother before her, did not deny them out of spite. She simply ensured that no one in her household would ever again eat crusts while others feasted on cake, that fairness, once established, would never again be allowed to erode. Constance, humbled by circumstances she had brought upon herself, gradually softened in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Whether from genuine remorse or simple recognition that her future comfort now depended entirely on Eliza's goodwill, she began, slowly and awkwardly, to treat her stepdaughter with something approaching respect, and eventually, though it took the better part of a year, with something that might almost have been called warmth. Sebastian's courtship of Eliza, freed at last from the shadows and constraints that had shaped their earlier meetings, unfolded in the open, witnessed by the entire county with an interest that bordered on obsession. Every gathering that season seemed to center on speculation about the Duke of Cawdry and the once overlooked Bramwell daughter he had so publicly championed. And Eliza, who had spent 5 years being invisible, found the sudden attention almost as difficult to navigate as the neglect that had preceded it. But Sebastian remained a steady presence through the transition, patient with her uncertainty, never rushing her toward decisions she was not ready to make. Their conversations continued much as they had begun, honest and unguarded, covering everything from estate management to childhood memories, to the small, ordinary observations that build genuine intimacy between two people learning to trust each other completely. He asked her, eventually, formally, in the same small side room near the kitchen where they had first truly spoken, surrounded not by candlelight and hidden ledgers, but by the full daylight of a partnership built on something far sturdier than a single evening's chivalry. Eliza said yes, and meant it completely, not because a duke's proposal represented an escape from her circumstances, for by then, her circumstances had already changed entirely through her own inheritance and effort, but because she had come to know Sebastian Vane as a man worth choosing freely, for his patience, his fairness, his willingness to see worth in a girl the rest of the world had overlooked. Their wedding took place the following spring, at Bramwell Hall itself, in the same dining room, where Eliza had once eaten crusts alone, while her stepsisters feasted on cake. The room was transformed for the occasion, filled with flowers and warm light, every guest present by Eliza's own invitation, extended even to those who had once looked past her without a second thought. Constance sat near the front, dressed with quiet dignity rather than her old commanding grandeur, watching her stepdaughter marry a duke with an expression that mingled genuine pride with the lingering weight of old regret. Charlotte and Diana, both eventually finding respectable matches of their own, though neither so grand as Eliza's, stood among the guests with expressions that had softened, over the intervening months, from jealousy into something closer to genuine, if imperfect, affection. Mrs. Pruitt wept openly through the entire ceremony, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had always known Eliza was destined for something better, though her memory of the past 5 years, when questioned gently by Eliza herself, seemed to grow more optimistic with each retelling. At the wedding breakfast that followed, held in that same transformed dining room, Eliza found herself seated at the head of the table for the first time in her memory, no longer at the foot receiving scraps but presiding over abundance she now shared freely with everyone present. When the cake was cut, a magnificent creation, far grander than anything Charlotte or Diana had ever been served in the old days, Eliza made certain, with a small private smile that only Sebastian fully understood, that every single guest received a generous portion, family and staff alike, servants who had once watched her endure her stepmother's cruelty, now seated as honored guests rather than invisible help. "You are smiling at something," Sebastian said quietly, leaning close as the celebration continued around them. "I am thinking," Eliza said, "that it took a very long road to arrive at a moment as simple as this. Cake enough for everyone at the table." "A road worth traveling, I hope," he said. "Entirely worth it," she said, and meant every word. As mistress of both Bramwell Hall and, eventually, the grand Cawdry estate itself, Eliza never forgot the years of quiet endurance that had shaped her. She established, within her first year as Duchess, a fund specifically intended to support young women left vulnerable by unfair guardianship arrangements, ensuring that girls in circumstances similar to her own former situation would have recourse and protection that she herself had lacked for far too long. She maintained close friendships with the household staff, who had shown her kindness during her hardest years, elevating Mrs. Pruitt to a position of genuine honor within the Cawdry household, when the older woman finally retired from active service. She and Sebastian built a marriage founded not on the sudden drama of their courtship, but on the steady, patient honesty that had first drawn them together, a partnership between equals who valued each other's genuine character over performance or position. Their household, unlike the one Eliza had grown up in, became known throughout the county for its warmth and fairness, a place where guests of every station were treated with equal courtesy, where no one, family or servant, ever again went without their fair share, while others feasted freely. Years later, when Eliza's own daughter asked her, as children eventually do, how she had come to marry a duke, Eliza would tell the story simply, without bitterness toward the stepmother and stepsisters who had once treated her so unfairly, choosing instead to emphasize the lesson she had carried forward from those difficult years. "I learned," she would tell her daughter, "that dignity does not depend on how others treat you, but on how you choose to carry yourself regardless. And I learned that the people who truly see your worth will find you, eventually, even in the quietest corners of a room, even when you believe yourself entirely overlooked." It was a lesson written plainly across the whole of her life, from a girl eating crusts alone at the foot of a grand table, to a duchess who ensured, for the remainder of her days, that no one under her care would ever again go without their fair share of the feast. A year into the marriage, when the household at Cawdry had settled into its new rhythms of fairness and warmth, a threat arrived that neither Eliza nor Sebastian had anticipated, one that tested everything they had built far more severely than any drawing-room gossip ever could. It began with a letter from a distant cousin of Sebastian's, a man named Lord Cedric Ashby, who had long resented his own distance from the Cawdry title and fortune, and who saw, in Sebastian's marriage to a woman of modest origin, an opportunity he had apparently been waiting years to exploit. The letter was polite on its surface, requesting a private meeting to discuss what it called irregularities in the transfer of the Bramwell estate, but beneath the courteous language ran a current of clear threat. Sebastian read the letter twice before handing it to Eliza without a word, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. Eliza read it more slowly, her stomach tightening as she understood the implication buried within its careful phrasing. "He is suggesting," she said finally, "that my father's will was improperly executed, that the trust naming me heir was never legally binding."
"It is nonsense," Sebastian said immediately.
Fairweather examined every document himself. The solicitor confirmed everything. "Nonsense does not need to be true to cause damage," Eliza said quietly, remembering, with sudden clarity, exactly how much damage a determined liar could inflict on a woman, with no one to defend her. She was no longer that woman, not entirely, but the old fear rose in her chest regardless, quick and familiar. If he brings a challenge before the courts, even a false one, it could delay everything, unsettle the tenants who depend on stability, give ammunition to anyone who still believes I married above my station, through trickery, rather than genuine affection. They met with Lord Ashby 3 days later, in a formal sitting room, at Cawdry, chosen deliberately for its imposing grandeur, meant to remind their visitor exactly whose ground he stood upon. Ashby arrived confident, a thin, sharp-featured man, with the particular smugness of someone who believed he held a winning hand, and he wasted little time laying out his demands. "The documents establishing Miss Bramwell, forgive me, the Duchess's claim to her father's estate, contain an irregularity," he said, producing papers of his own, copies he claimed to have obtained through a clerk sympathetic to his cause. A missing signature witness, dated improperly. It would not take much to convince a court that the entire trust was fraudulent, executed without proper legal standing. I imagine neither of you would wish such a scandal made public, particularly given how recently the Duchess's origins were already the subject of considerable gossip. "You are proposing blackmail," Sebastian said flatly, dressed in the language of legal concern. "I am proposing," Ashby said, unbothered, "a quiet settlement. A portion of the Bramwell income redirected to my own management, in exchange for my discretion regarding these unfortunate irregularities. Consider it a fair arrangement between family." Eliza had spent 5 years learning to recognize cruelty disguised as reasonableness, and she recognized it now, clearly, in Ashby's careful smile. But she was no longer the girl who had once endured such treatment silently, waiting for someone else to intervene on her behalf. "Mr. Fairweather," she said calmly, "would you bring the original documents, please?" Fairweather, who had been waiting in the adjoining room precisely for this moment, entered with a leather case Eliza had specifically requested he prepare in advance, anticipating exactly this kind of challenge from the moment Ashby's letter had first arrived. "The original trust," Eliza said, laying the true documents beside Ashby's copies, "properly witnessed by both the family solicitor and the presiding magistrate at the time of my father's death, as any legitimate copy would show, had you obtained one honestly, rather than through a bribed clerk with an incomplete file. I took the liberty, upon learning of your interest in my father's affairs, of having my solicitor review every document a second time, specifically to guard against exactly this sort of manufactured claim." Ashby's confident smile faltered slightly as he examined the papers before him, comparing signatures and dates with growing unease. "Furthermore," Eliza continued, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "I have taken the additional precaution of writing to the clerk who provided you with your incomplete copies, informing him that tampering with estate records constitutes a criminal offense, and that I would be pursuing the matter formally unless he cooperated fully with my solicitor's inquiry. He has, as it happens, already provided a full account of your arrangement, in writing, which I would be happy to submit to the courts myself, should you wish to pursue this matter any further." The color drained from Ashby's face as thoroughly as it had once drained from Constance's, though Eliza felt none of the satisfaction she might once have expected from such a moment, only a quiet, steady resolve to protect what she and Sebastian had built. "I do not say this to humiliate you, Lord Ashby," she added, softening only slightly. "I say it because I have spent enough of my life being underestimated by people who assumed my quietness meant weakness. I will not make the mistake of underestimating your ambition in return, but I will also not allow it to threaten the people who depend on this estate's stability, tenants, servants, and family alike." Ashby left Cawdry that afternoon with his scheme in ruins, his threats reduced to empty air by a woman he had assumed, based on nothing more than old rumors of her humble origins, would prove an easy target. Word of the confrontation spread quietly through certain circles, not as scandal, but as quiet testament to the new Duchess's formidable competence, and Ashby himself, facing the very real threat of criminal exposure over the bribed clerk, chose never to trouble the family again. That evening, once the household had settled and the immediate danger had passed, Sebastian found Eliza in the same small study where she still, out of old habit, preferred to review estate accounts by candlelight, rather than in the grander rooms available to her. "You never told me," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "that you had already anticipated a challenge like this." "I learned a long time ago," Eliza said, closing her ledger, "that security is never guaranteed simply because circumstances have improved. I nearly lost everything once, through my own trust in people who did not deserve it. I promised myself I would not make that mistake again, not for my own sake, and certainly not for the sake of everyone who now depends on us." Sebastian reached across the small table and took her hand, the same steady gesture he had offered her that first evening at the dinner where they had truly spoken, and Eliza found herself thinking, not for the first time, how far she had traveled from the girl who once believed herself invisible, unworthy of notice or defense. "I married a woman of remarkable strength," Sebastian said quietly. "I do not think I fully understood how remarkable until this evening." "You married a woman who spent 5 years learning to survive on very little," Eliza said, "and who does not intend to let anyone take away what she has finally been given. Not her home, not her family, and certainly not the man who first saw her worth through a window, when no one else in the world thought to look." Outside, the Cawdry estate settled into evening quiet, its fields and tenant cottages secure, its household staff treated with the fairness Eliza had insisted upon from her very first day as its mistress, and its future, hard-won through 5 years of quiet endurance, and one final, decisive stand, finally, completely secure. The girl who had once received bread while others received cake had built, in the end, a table generous enough for everyone, and had made certain, through every difficult step of the journey, that it would remain that way for the rest of her days.